Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 45. The oldest existing publisher of RPGs is still making waves.
Greetings, one and all, to Reading D&D Aloud. I am historian and nerd Ben Riggs. With me is in a legendary man in the tabletop gaming community, the vice president and co-owner of Chaosium, Michael O'Brien. Hello, Michael.
G'day, Ben. As we discussed when we were setting this up, I'm talking to you from the future. It's Wednesday at noon here, just to make life confusing.
Well, as an American, I have a lot of questions about the future, Michael, but I'm not
the future is bright. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank God.
It's all going to be good. It's all going to be good.
Oh, it's sweet relief. Michael, this is the best phone call of my life. Nominally, we're having you on to discuss Call of Cthulhu Live, but I also know that you are a huge RuneQuest fan.
Yep.
And my understanding is that you would like to do a little bit of reading from first edition RuneQuest. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I appreciate that this podcast is called Reading D&D Aloud, but with your kind permission, I've got the first edition of RuneQuest here, which came out just a couple of years after D&D. It came out in 1978. It was the first role-playing game that Chaosium published. It's set in the world of Glorantha, which they cheerfully misspelled on the back cover, but never mind. Anyway, I'm just going to do a very, very short reading. Okay, like it's 2 sentences.
No,
but I think it's a really good one because it fits with the theme.
I'm fascinated.
And that is the dedication to this role-playing game. And the dedication reads, dedicated to Dave Arnson and Gary Gygax, who first opened Pandora's box, and to Kevin St. Andre, who found it could be opened again.
And Kevin St. Andre wrote Tunnels and Trolls?
Tunnels and Trolls, yes, which also came out about the same time. So I think that's a really nice callback from Greg Stafford and the others who wrote the first edition of RuneQuest, say, hey, we're all here basically because of Dave Arnson and Gary Gygax, and we really appreciate that. So that was a really nice dedication to put in that first edition of RuneQuest.
Well, and given how not nice Gary could be to other game designers, it's especially generous. I want to say it was in Game Wizards by John Peterson that he talked about how at an early tabletop role-playing game design panel, I want to say it was Gary, Greg Stafford, and a couple other early designers, and that John Peterson describes Gary being a total tool to everyone else, basically accusing them of being like cheap copies of him in some way. So to in 1978 have that coming from Chaosium, it may be especially generous.
Yeah, it's a nice dedication. And you may have heard this story before, but you know that Greg Stafford owned the very first copy of Dungeons and Dragons.
Do you want to tell the story?
Yeah, I'll tell the story. And maybe some of your listeners have heard this one before, but it's a really cool story. So Greg didn't actually buy the first copy. What happened was, back in the 60s, Greg Stafford was a itinerant belt buckle salesman before he became a world-famous game designer. And he hitchhiked around the Midwest selling belt buckles. As he described it, it was a real hippie job. That was his phrase. And the belt buckles they sold were made by the Bergamont Belt Buckle Works that is based in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And that purely coincidentally. And anyway, after he'd done that for a while, he went back to the Bay Area where he lived and was actually starting to put together the idea of publishing his own game, which was called White Bear and Red Moon. It was a board war game set in the world of Glorantha. But his friend that he did the belt buckle selling with was still continuing doing the hippie thing back in the Midwest. And one day in Lake Geneva, he went into a print shop to pick up some flyers. I think they used to give out flyers about their belt buckles. And there was a guy in there picking up his printing. And they were kind of just talking while they were waiting for the stuff to be brought out. And when the guy mentioned that he'd put together this game, Greg's friend said, "Oh, I got a friend back in San Francisco who'd love this sort of thing. Would you mind selling me a copy?" So Greg's friend bought literally the first ever copy of Dungeons and Dragons off the presses from Gary Gygax, who was going in to pick up the printing, and sent it to Greg. And Greg regrets that years later, I think he loaned it to somebody he loaned it to his dungeon master, he said. So obviously he was playing D&D. And he kind of forgot who he'd loaned it to, and he never got it back. And he regretted that because he thinks, oh, it could be worth a lot of money these days.
I mean, yeah, first ever purchased copy of D&D purchased by Greg Stafford. That's
Yeah.
Someone should make a movie about the search for that item. That's good.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's got a legendary beginning. So that was before Greg was, I guess, even a role-playing game designer. Greg began as a board war game designer and did White Bear and Red Moon. And the reason why he founded the company Chaosium exactly 50 years ago, by the way, it's Chaosium's 50th anniversary this year, was he couldn't find someone to publish it. He had a couple of people that were keen, but that fell through. So in the end, he founded the company himself, Chaosium, in 1975.
I mean, that is a remarkable synchronicity in that's why Gygax founded TSR, was he couldn't find anybody to publish D&D. Gaiden Games, I want to say, was like, no one would ever want to buy any supplements for Dungeons and Dragons, so we're not going to make it. So off he goes, and Greg Stafford. That's fascinating that he did the same thing.
So
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, what he did is he said he made that resolution to say, "Yeah, I'm going to do this myself." So he and his then wife went and actually worked really hard for a whole year. He was basically working as a hospital orderly and taking every shift he could to save up all the money they could to set up this company. And he named it the Chaosium because at the end of their street was the Oakland Coliseum, which is a stadium. And I believe that they were living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time with another family. So there was a lot of chaos. So that's where the name comes from, the Coliseum and chaos.
Now, Greg Stafford has a mythic reputation in the realm of tabletop role-playing game designers. I mean, just to toss off one thing off the top of my head, John Wick, who went on to design Legend of the Five Rings, inserted Greg Stafford into his game as a wise old samurai called the Gray Crane, who was both a poet and a mystic and a warrior. But if I have 12-year-olds listening and I have 75-year-olds listening, to one of those 12-year-olds who's only played D&D, who is Greg Stafford, and why was he a seminal figure in the field?
Yeah, okay. So Greg Stafford is a game designer. Sadly, Greg passed away in 2018, very sadly. So he's no longer with us. But throughout his long career, he managed to catch lightning in a bottle several times, which I think is really cool. So I guess the first thing he did is he created the world of Glorantha, and that is a fantasy setting, or Glorantha as it was misspelled on the back cover of the first edition, but never mind. That is a fantasy setting of his own creation. Greg was very, very much into mythology, so it's a very mythic setting where the gods are real. And Greg spent many years investigating and exploring Glorantha, first as a board war game, And then when tabletop RPGs were invented by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, he explored the idea of doing a D&D version for the world of Glorantha. And after they'd play tested it for a while or whatever, they decided if they could come up with a different way of approaching it, and brought in another very famous, or who became a famous game designer called Steve Perrin. And Steve came out of the Society of Creative Anachronism, which is the people who wear armor and go beat each other up with foam-covered swords. So Steve injected an element of, or tried to inject an element of as much realism as possible into like the combat and the skills and things like that. So RuneQuest is a game where you roll percentile dice. And as I discovered when I was 13 and first encountered RuneQuest, it has hit locations. So you could cut someone's leg off. And believe me, that was very appealing as a 13-year-old, because, yeah, you couldn't do that in D&D, but you could do it in RuneQuest. Anyway, so Greg published RuneQuest in 1978, and that was launched at the first at Origins, one of the early Origins conventions, and sold out, and was such a success that it was reprinted in a second edition and became a popular RPG at the time. There were two important things that I think Greg did very early in the piece with RuneQuest. One is he came up with the concept, your Glorantha may vary. And what he means by that is he says, here's how I've mapped out the world. Here's how I say things happen and everything. When you go off and play the game, you might do it differently. And it started as actually your Glorantha may vary. And then later on, he actually refined that into your Glorantha will vary. And so, okay, there is canon. There's what Greg has created, and people have gone on and developed further, and we've published officially at Chaosium. But you can take that and you can do what you want with it. And that's with Greg's blessing, which I think is a great attitude to have. And then the second thing he did very early in the piece was actually in I know it was in a scenario called the Sea Cave, and I think he wrote it elsewhere as well. He said, when the player characters run screaming, they run away, don't forget the monsters get experience rolls too. Okay? And so what he means by that is the monsters aren't just kind of like fixed objects sitting in a room waiting for you to encounter them. They have their own lives and motivations and intentions as well. So it was more or less saying that, monsters are people too. And that's all comes back to the idea that this world of Glorantha is very real, I guess you could say. And everybody in there has a reason for what they're doing. And yeah, so they're two very interesting things that these came about in like the in the late 70s, which I think is pretty interesting way of taking things forward. The other thing that they did was publish also in the late 70s, 1979, I think it was, is they published a book called Cults of Prax. Are you familiar with that one, Ben?
It's funny, as you were talking, I'm taking notes here, and right before I wrote down your Glorantha may vary, I wrote, ask about Cults of Prax. So please, tell us why Cults of Prax deserves to be in the Smithsonian here in America because of its importance to the tabletop role-playing game industry.
I kind of think it does. So there's a pretty direct reason. It's basically the first ever splat book, I guess you could say, for a tabletop RPG. And I know Shannon Appelkline has described it as that in his histories, and he's pretty definitive.
He's in the know. He'll know.
Yeah. The thing that I really like about it is it is essentially a book about Gloranthan gods and the religions that worship those gods and how that all works. And I guess if you compare how that treatment was done to, say, the way gods were discussed in deities and demigods at about the same time, it couldn't be more different because uh, in deities and demigods, all the gods kind of are just giant, mega characters, right? With hit points and all these other
Yeah,
things.
I want to say Krishna got hit points, Cthulhu got hit points, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whereas in Cults of Prax, the gods are gods. And this is more or less describing how they interact with the world, how the religions work, and how you can follow that god as a character and what benefits and things you get and advantages and disadvantages. And I think that was an interesting approach to take. Also, very early in the development of RPGs.
Yeah, because it
But
made you the sorry, go
go
ahead.
on. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Because it made your choices about your character have game effects, right? Like if depending on what god you chose, you got different special abilities.
Oh, very much so. Yes. And also you are buying into like the whole history of that cult. So if you are part of the Sun cult, then you're going to have enemy cults that don't like you, and you might have cults that generally you cooperate together, and there are ways to interact in the world and so on. And I think that's that gives a whole lot of depth and, I'm going to say, realism to your characters and their motivations.
Well, unlike D&D, so again, D&D to some degree is trying to be a generic rule set for fantasy that you could plug
Mm-hmm.
into almost any fantasy location, place, time. And RuneQuest is not that. RuneQuest is we are simulating one world, Glorantha, correct?
Correct. Well, funny you say that because the first and second edition, absolutely, it's a world setting Glorantha, and then they brought out a third edition of the game, which they did in collaboration with the Avalon Hill Game Company. And the third edition of the game, they actually did make it into a generic rule set,
Hmm.
and sort of Glorantha was there as well, but sort of on the side. And you can argue whether that was a good move or not. One argument to say that it wasn't is that when we brought out a new edition of RuneQuest back in 2018, we brought it fully back to Glorantha. And we actually have, and this is something Greg did too, by the way. We also have a game called Basic Role Playing Universal Game Engine, and that is the generic D100 rules. That was reverse engineered out of RuneQuest. So RuneQuest came first, and then they built a generic rule set for it called BRP, Basic Role Playing. And so that also exists in its own way that people can take and use. And we released a version of that under the Orc license, following another interesting thing that Watsy did a couple of years ago.
And again, I should shout out to any 12-year-olds listening that the basic role playing system is based on a D100 roll, where if you're usually using a skill and you want to roll under the skill, it's I think the easiest system for a new player to pick up and roll with because everyone understands percentiles.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to explain. You got a jump of 60, roll under 60, you succeed in your jump. Yeah. So very true. We haven't even scratched the surface though, because after this, Greg was involved in. He didn't actually write it, but yeah, he was the president of the company when it happened in 1981. Call of Cthulhu was published, and there we go from there. That's been Chaosium's biggest success. It's after kind of D&D and Pathfinder and games in that ilk, it's probably one of the most popular tabletop RPGs in the world. In some countries, it's absolutely the most popular tabletop
Go
RPG.
Japan, go!
Yeah, and Korea and some other places. And Greg was not actually involved in the writing of that game. That's by another famous game designer who worked for Chaosium, and that's Sandy Peterson.
Yeah,
So
I had him and Ken Height on just for my Patreon subscribers a I think a month ago. So if
Okay.
you're listening to this and you are interested, for a mere $3 a month, you can hear the fascinating conversation that Ken Hite had with Sandy Peterson about Cthulhu game design and all things in that realm. But to just loop back around here, D&D has never been my main jam. Call of Cthulhu is probably my main jam. I've probably played and run more Call of Cthulhu than any other game. So it really it found me at the right time. It has put me in its dark tentacular embrace, and in many ways I have never left it. Um, but again, now you're a RuneQuest guy though, first and foremost, right?
I am, yeah, yeah. So I discovered I played D&D when I was a kid, and a friend of mine bought Apple Lane, which is one of the first RuneQuest scenario supplements that came out, and we reversed engineered how to play RuneQuest from looking at the stat blocks. I think I was like 13 at the time. And yeah, when we saw that and thought, hey, you can cut someone's leg off with this, we were hooked. So there you go.
For me, I think that the Call of Cthulhu role playing game and Lovecraft's fiction, which I came to from the game, um, traced a sort of existential arc in my life from believing Catholic to probably an agnostic atheist now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was something about being able to express the fear of meaninglessness through the game that was, I guess, soothing actually. Uh, but so let me ask you this: what is it about RuneQuest that just sucked you in?
So, apart from being able to cut someone's leg off when you're 13, that's super cool. The world of Glorantha is such a rich and interesting place. And I loved the fact that Greg gave license to say, your Glorantha will vary. Come up with cool things yourself. And that's the way we went with that. We loved the I really like the rules in RuneQuest. I love the fact that in combat in RuneQuest, it's kind of deadly. It's combat in Call of Cthulhu is deadly, right? Even just two normal people fighting each other can be deadly. So that kind of, unlike sort of like a slog fest where you just start with 60 hit points and wear them all down, in RuneQuest, every fight you go in could be your last, even if you are a super powerful character. You could be taken out with, a knife in the back. And I kind of like the fact that combat is visceral and real and scary. And that also leads in role playing to violence isn't always the solution. Running away might be, or coming up with other approaches because combat is so deadly. I actually really like that approach.
So,
Yeah,
go
go
ahead.
on. You go ahead.
So, what is it about the world in particular? Like, if you were going to give me one thing, like, again, like if I was going to do this for Call of Cthulhu, I'd say it's the meaningless of the universe. If I was going to do this for Legend of the Five Rings, I would say the thing about the world I love is that you get to be a samurai, and there's so many different kinds of samurai that interact. But there's again a prohibition on violence, kind of like RuneQuest, that drives narrative in a new direction. So, if you're going to name one thing about the world, again, to a 12-year-old that would hopefully hook them in, what might it be?
I'd say that it's a a world similar to our own, except it's a world where the gods are
Hmm.
real and magic is real, and it's a Bronze Age world. And you can show them pictures of. Hey, I'll show you a picture. Actually, this is
Show us,
a
show us.
shameless plug. So I wrote a RuneQuest supplement in 1992 called Sun County. And its one line pitch would be Spartans in the Wild West. And you can see that they kind of look like that on the cover there. This was a cover done by Roger Raup, who was a very talented fantasy artist. And what had happened is I'd been in RuneQuest fandom. We actually did a RuneQuest fanzine called Tales of the Reaching Moon, which I did that with a colleague in the United Kingdom. He actually started the magazine. I was really lucky. I'd written some RuneQuest articles for White Dwarf magazine, because White Dwarf magazine long ago used to actually be a general tabletop RPG magazine. And Games Workshop published RuneQuest back in the day as well. And I'd written some articles for it, and they'd been accepted for publication, which was super cool. And then one day I got a envelope in the mail, and I opened it up, and it was my articles returned to me. This is for the young folks out there. This was like letters with stamps on them and things like that. That was done in those days. So they were returned to me, and there was a cover note from the then RuneQuest editor for White Dwarf saying, "Look, I'm just letting you know that White Dwarf is changing its editorial direction. It's going to turn into just for, Warhammer or whatever. So we're not publishing RuneQuest anymore. However, you might be interested in this fanzine, Tales of the Reaching Moon." And he included a copy of issue 1. And that was very, very generous of him to do that, because he had to mail it to me from the United Kingdom to Australia, which, cost money. And he sent me a copy of the first edition of this magazine. And I looked at that and thought, hey, this is awesome. So I immediately sent my stuff to that magazine. And by issue 4, I was the associate editor of that magazine. So that's kind of my origin story. I'm really lucky that Games Workshop decided not to publish other RPGs. That's why I'm here today.
You and I have talked about RuneQuest a lot, because again, I'm fascinated by things that people are passionate about. But I don't think I've ever asked you, what are the best adventures for RuneQuest? Because again, I've kind of thought about this in terms of, if you're going to get a RuneQuest, how do you do it? And you guys have a lovely starter set that's absolutely beautiful for people that want to get into it. But I don't think I've ever asked you, what are the best adventures for RuneQuest?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. And there are definitely some classic adventures that are amazing, and there's some new ones that are amazing as well. How long do we have? Anyway.
I love that answer. Again, I love things that people are passionate about. I love it that's the answer.
Okay, I really love this. Okay, so back in the day, one of the first RuneQuest campaigns I played in was a box set that came out in about 1983, I think it was. It's called Borderlands. So it's not the video game. It's a totally different thing. And what it is, it was very clever, because it was a set of, I think it's 7 scenarios that follow one after the other. And you are essentially, the player characters are mercenaries who are hired by a duke who had been exiled from kind of the equivalent of the Roman Empire and sent out to, the Borderlands, and he's got to start anew. And he hires you as mercenaries to help carve out this territory and everything else. One of the really cool aspects of that is you didn't need to know really anything about the world, because you're sort of in the middle of nowhere. And so you discover and learn about the world as you play through it. And I think that was a really clever approach to designing a set of sequential adventures that enabled the player characters to scaffold their understanding of a deep and rich world. I think that was really well done. There's a side story to that, though, and that is, this box, Borderlands, has the name of all the designers on the cover, and it has Greg Stafford. It has just surnames, actually: Stafford, Peterson, so on. One of those names on that cover is Hoffman. Okay.
Who could that be?
And I didn't know this at the time, but I tell you, I would have been as jealous as hell. As a 15, I think I was 15 years old at that time. If I'd known that Hoffman was actually a 13-year-old kid whose name is on the cover of that box, same size as Greg Stafford and everybody else. What had happened is, this kid knocked on the door of the Chaosium offices in about 1982. And it was actually Steve Perrin who who met him. And this kid said to Steve Perrin, I love RuneQuest, but seriously, you're doing it all wrong. And showed him like his copy of the RuneQuest rules written in red pen all over it. And rather than Steve Perrin saying, "Get lost, kid," Steve looked at it and said, "Hey, actually, this is pretty cool. This is pretty good." So gave him the manuscript to Borderlands, said, "Go away and tell us what you think of this." Anyway, the kid comes back a week later and red pen all over it and everything. And that led to him doing some like editing work for Chaosium and getting paid for it. And so that was that kid's first ever paid gig. And as you know, because you wrote an article about this for, I can't remember.
Geek and Sundry, I want to say, back when
Geek and
Sundry was a thing.
Yeah, a number of years ago. That kid was actually Reid Hoffman, who grew up to be the founder of PayPal and LinkedIn, is I think like the 7th or 8th richest person in the United States. So he got his start at Chaosium.
Yeah, yesterday Elon Musk, I think, blamed him for Twitter going out or something. It was
what?
Again,
well,
they're warring billionaires now. So,
well, all I know is when we did our RuneQuest Classic Kickstarter in 2016, Reid Hoffman did back it, which was very cool of him. I will point out, and this is part of maybe why he's one of the richest people in the world. He didn't back it at the top level. He was prudent with his funds.
That's the makings of an oligarch right there.
There you go. So, yeah, I'm going to say Borderlands was very seminal to me. Playing it as and I think I was in my late teens at the time, and I thought it was a wonderful introduction to Glorantha. I think that playing that really cemented to me just how rich and interesting the world was, and the places that you could go with that.
And is that available in PDF?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, you can actually buy, and you can buy that in print as well. So it did originally come out in a box. We've released for what is called Glorantha Classics, like a print version of it as a book, and you can get that at the KSM website. And so this book, this is my plug again. This book also came out originally for RuneQuest 3rd edition, and we've been able to release it as a Glorantha Classic. And here's the funny thing there, I wrote that as what's called a work for hire, which means you do it, you get paid, you don't own the rights to it or anything else. And then it twigged to me a number of years ago, hey, I now am a co-owner of Chaosium, so I have the rights to my own book back again. So that's part of the reason why we bought it out again.
That's really fun. Yeah. All right, well, I guess I should ask at least something about the reason that I'm nominally having you on the show, which is Call of Cthulhu Live, which is an actual play that is Chaosium sponsoring it in the UK.
Okay, all right. Hey, just before we do that, I'm going to say
Go for it.
Several other things that Greg Stafford did that are amazing, because we didn't even get to like other things. He created the Pendragon RPG, which I think, and he considered that his masterpiece, by the way. He says that is like the culmination of his RPG design, and it is. I don't know if you've ever played it. It is one of the most elegant rule sets that you can play, and it just perfectly encapsulates the setting, which is the King Arthur stories. And the other thing that Greg was involved with was working for West End Games. Chaosium worked as like a game design studio. They designed the Ghostbusters RPG.
And I'm trying to remember, was Ghostbusters the first dice pool game?
Correct.
Okay.
So Greg, Sandy, and the Chaosium team came up with that. So they more or less founded dice pools. So, there you go. Final thing I'm going to say about Greg before we flip back to Call of Cthulhu Live. I went to Sandy described Greg as the only person he's ever met with a natural 18 charisma. And he really was a charismatic guy. And I remember going to Greg's memorial in Arcata. He lived in, for the last years of his life, he lived in Northern California in the city of Arcata. And I remember going up there with my colleagues, and we went to this memorial, and we met a whole lot of people that Greg knew in Arcata. And it was so fascinating that several people would say to me, "Oh, Greg, one of the most interesting, fascinating people I've ever met," and would talk about all the different things. And then they'd say, "Oh, and I hear he had something to do with game design." you know, that's sort of the impact that he had. So he is sorely missed. Greg was only 70 when he died, and the I guess one thing I'm very happy about is that Chaosium had some trouble, some financial issues and things, which I think you also wrote about for
For
Geek and
Geek and
Sundry
Sundry,
back in the
yeah.
day. And so he did actually get to see that the company's fortunes turned around. He worked on the final, he called it his ultimate edition of Pendragon, which we are now releasing, and so on. So he did get to see all of that, which was super cool.
Is Chaosium the oldest existing role-playing game company?
It's the oldest existing role-playing company that is still its own thing. So Greg Stafford's family are still part of the ownership of the company, and his wife and daughter are on the Chaosium board. And so, yeah, our company goes back 50 years as a continuous thing. There are some other companies that still have the same name, but they're kind of like not owned by themselves and so on, like Wizards of the Coast, for example.
Yeah, I mean, they own all the TSR stuff, but Wizards is not TSR, and hell, Wizards isn't Wizards anymore. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just Hasbro. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
for good and for ill, although it seems like it's mostly for ill these days. Um, and man, I I'm interviewing Wizards people as they are fired and leave right now, and I was listening to an interview I did with Liz Shu, who was in marketing at Wizards for, I want to say she was hired in 1995 and fired like 14 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So she saw Wizards as it was, and then Wizards as it became once Hasbro had a good couple decades to kind of sink its talons into the company. And again, when she describes Wizards in the 90s, it's this freaky place that's kind of young, people are cool. Um, the first day that she's at work, she's taken into Peter Adkison's office, and she's like she can to this day remember what his office looked like. And she just describes this like golden age of for nerds at Wizards. And as the interview goes on, that just keeps getting chipped away and chipped away and chipped away and chipped away, until there's, nothing left in many ways of the company that Adkison Stevens, can't remember the Magic Gathering lead designer guy, but him, helped to make. So,
Right.
and Case Chaosium, even though you guys have had obviously like, uh, I suppose you are the new owner of Chaosium, but it certainly seems like there has been continuity of service in a way that there was not at TSR
Yeah.
or even Wizards for that matter.
So our connection with Chaosium goes back a long way. So I had my first manuscript rejected by Chaosium in 1987, for
Amazing.
example. And then all of us, the co-owners of the company, we came up through fandom interacting with Chaosium the whole way through. So it's not like we're kind of like newcomers that have come in just at the end there. Yeah. So it's been an interesting ride, and we're now moving into some new things, and that's kind of what, if I can reverse it now back to talking about Call of Cthulhu Live. What we've started doing is, actual plays become a really big thing in recent years, and I'm going to tell you this. If someone had told me back when I was a teenager, people would sit and watch people play games on stage and go, "What, really?" But anyway, people love it, and they should, because it's really cool. So we have embraced that. And last year we did a Call of Cthulhu live show on stage at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is a very, very big arts festival in the UK, in the city of Edinburgh. And we had someone from a company called AEG Presents, which is a theatrical promotions company, one of the biggest ones in the world, reach out to us and say, hey, we want to come up and see the show. We said, sure. After they saw the show, they then said, that show was great. Let's take it on the road. And so we've worked with them to do a 5-city tour in the UK later this year, actually at the end of May and early June, which we're calling Call of Cthulhu Live, and we're going to play Call of Cthulhu on stage. And starting on the 29th of May, we're in Birmingham. Then we go to Brighton and London and Manchester and Glasgow. And we've got like a absolutely stellar cast of investigators who are going to play Call of Cthulhu on stage with Mark Meir, who is, he's well known as the voice actor for Commander Shepard from the Mass Effect video game. He's also an incredibly talented Call of Cthulhu keeper.
Really? That's amazing. Commander Shepard.
Yeah.
Wow.
If you want to see him as a keeper, we also last year did a show called Graveyards of Arkham, which we have. It's a 6-part series on our website, and Mark is the keeper for that. And it's very creepy. So the idea is we play it on stage. We have an audience, a live audience. There's lots of audience interaction, and it's creepy and horrible and lots of fun.
One of my obsessions is that I think Wizards of the Coast focuses on sales and profits, which they're going to do because they're Hasbro, and I understand that. But that leads them to thinking about how are we going to sell more books? We should appeal to players. And I think that is fundamentally a strategic mistake. And I think that you want to focus on game masters, dungeon masters, the people running the game, and eventually you then sell your books as that more and more people are running your game. And that kind of thing is something that I think Chaosium is so good at, is catering to game masters. Call of Cthulhu is kind of centered around, hey, we're going to make adventures that it's going to make it easier for you to run, and you're going to have amazing handouts that you can use in your game that are going to be really immersive, and it's going to make you want to run it and make your life easier. And actual plays are another thing that I think now it's just so crucial to getting your game out there, showing people what your game is, and making them want to play it. I don't know that there's a replacement for that. It's and again, as a 46-year-old dude in America, I'm kind of with you in that, like, I don't spend a bunch of time watching actual plays because I'm just like, I'd rather plan my game and go play it. But again, when I talk to anyone under 30, and people who listen a lot will have heard me say this a ton of times. Every woman I know under 30 who plays tabletop role-playing games got into it through actual plays.
Yep.
And in my school, the women under 30 outnumber anybody else playing tabletop role-playing games. So again, I think it's just so wise and sagacious, and it's such a good long-term strategy for Chaosium to get involved in something like this.
Yeah. So AEG, for example, also did the Critical Role shows that
Wow.
were at Wembley Stadium and things. So they know a thing or two about actual play. But we definitely want to support GMs. And there's two other interesting things we do for that. One is to learn about how to play a game. Learning by doing is if you just sit and read a rule book, that's probably the hardest way to learn to play a game. The easiest way is to actually play it. So in our starter sets, we have solo scenarios that teach you the rules of the game. So in the Call of Cthulhu starter set, we have a solo scenario called Alone Against the Flames. It takes about 25 minutes to play. And as you play through it, it's a choose your own adventure type thing. You get to do a library use roll, and you get to do a sanity roll, and you make some choices and decisions about your character. And by the end of it, actually, I know how the Call of Cthulhu rules work because I've played through this. We have a similar one in our RuneQuest starter set that teaches you RuneQuest. And we have a Rivers of London role-playing game. And which is set on the urban fantasy series by Ben Aranovich. And again, we have a solo adventure in that you can play. And the other cool thing is, you can actually just give that to like potential players who, you want to come and play this game? Try this solo adventure and 20 minutes of your time, and you'll know how to play the game, which I think is a really cool and effective way to learn. The other thing about actual players, I think it's really important to have some actual plays that have an emphasis. I guess I'm going to say a pedagogical emphasis that actively say, watch this and you'll learn how to play the game. So, for example, we released a new game called Quest Worlds. And Quest Worlds was originally called Hero Wars by Robin Laws. It's a storytelling game that we released in 2008. Greg Stafford really wanted to call it Hero Quest, but of course, if you remember, there was the Milton Bradley board game. They had the trademark for that. Well, I think it might have been Hasbro back then, but whoever it was let the trademark lapse. So Greg was able to bring out the game then as Hero Quest. But a few years ago, Hasbro approached us and said, we really want to bring back the board game again. Can we buy the trademark off you? So we sold the trademark back to them.
They brought you a dump truck full of money.
Yeah, and that's a long roundabout way of saying we've released Quest Worlds. I think we're filming it actually later today. We're doing a actual play that is specifically to say, hey, watch this, and you'll learn how to play the game. And we're doing it with all 4 players in it have never played Quest Worlds before. Because then it is really an authentic learning experience. It's not someone pretending to learn how to play the game. It's someone learning how to play the game. And our selling point for Quest Worlds is really easy to learn. So I hope we managed to carry it off in this video.
What can you tell me about Quest World?
So Quest Worlds is a narrative storytelling game. And it is a game that doesn't have things like hit points and so on. It's really all about it's more like a collaborative storytelling game. And it really has basically one mechanic that just covers everything. Really works well for sort of heroic storytelling type games and superhero games and things like that. If you're going to play an investigative game, probably better to play Call of Cthulhu. But we cover all the bases. We cover all the bases there.
That's fascinating because again, I saw it in an email from Chaosium, and I was like, oh, from Greg Stafford and Robin Laws, and hearing that it was
two big names.
Yeah, but hearing it used to be Hero Wars, I'm like, oh, okay, now it makes sense. I'm like, it wasn't something that Greg and Robin were working on a few years ago before he passed away that I just missed. So it makes me feel
so probably the biggest thing that Greg worked on before he passed away was the Ultimate Edition, as he called it, of Pendragon, which we've released like the starter set and the core rule book for that, and I think we're going to be releasing the GM book for that later this month. So that's a really great legacy for Greg to leave everybody.
So how is if you don't know the answer to this or it's a secret, that's fine. But how is the adventure prepared for Call of Cthulhu Live? Do you just expect the Commander Shepard to write it? Do you guys write something and give it to him?
No. So that's a very good question. So, for example, in Edinburgh, what we did is we actually had Mike Mason's the creative director for Call of Cthulhu, and he came up to be the keeper for that. And what we did is we deliberately made a scenario set in Edinburgh, and he was kind of. We had it at the National Library of Scotland, by the way, and we convinced them to be the venue to host it by telling them, you realize that in Call of Cthulhu, the heroes are librarians. As soon as we said that, they were hooked. So Mike discovered that there'd been a theatre that burned down in 1924 in Edinburgh. So it was like on the afternoon of June the 4th, it burned down. So, of course, our scenario was set on the afternoon of June the 4th, and it burned down. What a surprise. For Call of Cthulhu Live, I think we're still talking about what we're going to do for that. we might do something from a published scenario collection we have. We have several collections of one shot adventures that are really designed to be played in just a couple of hours. So they kind of have really punchy beats. And so we're looking at that. And but I've said to Mark, we're doing it in 5 venues. We're probably not going to do 5 different scenarios because that'd be a heck of a lot of preparation for him. And I'm thinking, if we've got a show in Brighton and we've got a show in Glasgow, they are at the opposite ends of the UK. So it's very unlikely we've got the same audience members going to both. So we might do the same thing in the 2 locations. The other thing we've gotten, we're going to announce these soon, is we're going to have some walk-on guests coming too, because there'll be some people who are going out there for UK Games Expo and other things that are going to be around, and they couldn't commit to the whole time, but they may be able to make some walk-on guest spots as well. So that'll be fun.
Anything exciting coming up from Chaosium in the next 6 months to a year that we should that you want to brag about?
Well, I think the coolest thing is Chaosium is 50 this year. It's our 50th anniversary, and we are doing some events to celebrate the fact that the company is 50 years old. We've produced a 50th anniversary pin, which we're going to be giving to GMs that do stuff for us at conventions and events. I think we're kicking that off at GaryCon. Is GaryCon later this month? I think
It
it is in a
is
couple of
in
weeks.
10 days.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to kick it off at GaryCon. We're going to be having some special events at different conventions to mark the 50th anniversary. The other thing we're doing is we have something called Chaosium Con, which we've done in Ann Arbor, Michigan for, I think, this might be our 5th year or 4th year. We did Chaosium Con Australia last year as well, and we're going to do Chaosium Con Australia again this year. We are also doing Chaosium Con UK, and I might be giving you a scoop here. There might even be another Chaosium Con at the end of the year somewhere. Yeah. Oh, I think I've let the cat out of the bag there. But anyway, and those events we'll be doing some big celebrations about it. We've got some some products we're going to release to celebrate the 50th anniversary as well, coming out later in the year, and we'll announce those soon. One of the ones we're working on is a book of classic covers. And the real challenge for that is we've brought out a lot of stuff over the last 50 years. And okay, this book's probably going to have, I don't know, maybe 48 covers in it. And I think that's going to be the challenge.
Yeah, how do you choose? How do you choose?
Winnow it down to the 48 covers that we think are. And one of the criteria I've set for that project is it's not necessarily, there are some covers that are artistically wonderful and brilliant, but there are also some important products that I think deserve to be featured there as well. So I'll give an example. One of them is a game that came out in the early 80s called Hawkmoon, which is based on the creation by Michael Moorcock. And fortunately, that is a really cool looking cover. But that's also really distinctive. That was done by Kerry Campbell. And Kerry was one of the first ever female lead designers for a tabletop RPG. So I think that's worth celebrating. The other really cool thing about this, again, that would have made me jealous because I was about the same age. She was actually like 19 when that was published. So there you go.
Well, before we close, since you said GaryCon, I will shout out to the audience. If you're going to be at GaryCon, I'll be there on Saturday at 6 p.m. doing a live episode of Reading D&D Aloud with special guest David Zeb Cook, who was the lead designer of second edition. There are still a few tickets left if you want to hear me, Dr. Scott Bruner, and Zeb Cook chew the fat. 6 p.m. on Saturday. If you're going, I'd love to see you there. Michael, I can't thank you enough for taking out the time to talk. This has been amazing, delightful, enlightening, enjoyable. Every time I talk to you, I want to go play some RuneQuest. Now, I never have. I've never played even a session. But every time we get done, I'm like, I bought like all the stuff that you need to play. I should just run some RuneQuest one of
Well,
these
let's
days.
make that happen. Let's seriously make that happen because that would be loads of fun.
Well, maybe I should. I'll try and find a game when I'm at GaryCon because I'm sure somebody's running a RuneQuest game there.
I'm sure there will. So we are at GaryCon. I personally won't be there, sadly. Be a very long way for me to come, but a whole crew from the Chaosium team will be there, and I'm sure there's some RuneQuest going on.